Hello, and thanks for joining today's presentation on the right way to select social collaboration technology. My name is Scott Dill, and I'm on the business development team here with Real Story Group. Our company founder, Tony Byrne, will be on the line momentarily to walk us through the heart of today's presentation. But I did want to point out a couple of housekeeping items of note here as we get started. First, for all the folks that are attending today, we'll be sending over the slides from the presentation within the next couple of days. And for our subscribers on the line, you'll also be able to access a recording of the session in your subscriber library. Also, if you have questions, you can type those into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to those at the end of today's session. What I wanted to do for those that are new to Real Story Group is just walk you through a little bit about our company. And really the main way that folks will work with us is by subscribing to our research on digital technology. We cover 8 different marketplaces, and what we do is provide you with detailed evaluations of what the vendors are good at, but maybe more importantly, where they could fall short for you. You can actually also utilize our tools for creating a short list that's customized to your criteria. You can also compare the vendors side by side with each other, and if you're looking at benchmarking your incumbent vendor, you can do that with our RealScore application and then measure how you stack up against your industry peers. We do take on a select number of consulting projects throughout the year as well, where we can actually come on site and be an extension of your team to help you through a strategic roadmap type of engagement or through a technology selection project. What makes us different from other analyst firms that you may have come across in the past is that we do no work for the vendors that we evaluate within our research. So what this means is we don't speak at their conferences or write white papers for them. Our only focus is on helping you to select the right digital technology solution for what it is that you're trying to do. And as I mentioned, we cover 8 particular marketplaces, and we've actually added on their map here our orange line, which is CRM technology. That's the latest addition to this map. And so we certainly recommend taking a look at those samples when you have an opportunity. But today we're going to focus on the red line, which is enterprise collaboration and social software. And from there, I'll turn things over to Tony to really kick off the presentation. Tony?
Great, thanks, Scott. I'll start with a little bit of a story that I like to tell around technology selection. Some of you may have seen this slide before. It's a little bit of a takeoff on the Magic Quadrant, which to be sure is kind of easy to mock, but I pointed out because it was this quadrant that had me found Real Story Group, actually the predecessor company, CMS Watch. In 2001, I was working at a systems integrator. We were implementing some tools that were in the top right quadrant, and the customer was asking us, why isn't this working very well? And we dug in deeper and found out that there were actually significant problems and mismatches between not just difficulties with the technology, but mismatch with the customer that this whole kind of horse race analysis never would have revealed for them. So I thought there had to be a different way of telling the real story about not just what vendor strengths are, but what are their weaknesses, and how do you go about actually selecting the right tools so that you don't end up with something that's a poor fit. And so that led me to CMS Watch and ultimately Real Story Group, where we provide tools and capabilities to help you do just that. So what we're going to talk about a little bit is the overall context of the digital workplace technology landscape, and then do a deep dive on social collaboration tools, including both functional and kind of strategic considerations, and then finish up with the last 10 minutes or so with how do you actually go about selecting these tools, how not to, and then how to take a more sort of design thinking approach to this that we've been elaborating over the last 16 years. And again, if you have any questions at all, feel free to just enter then questions, comments, criticisms, feedback, anything you'd like to share. Feel free to use the questions tab and go to webinar. All right, so let's get into it. Here's a typical digital workplace, what we might call Layercake Diagram. This is often used by enterprise architects. It's useful in that connection to sort of show what are the different sort of functional or logical elements and how do they relate to each other, so you can start thinking about data flows and that sort of thing. So it's useful. The one problem with this particular approach is it's the enterprise view of itself, right? So to that extent, it has real limitations. You notice that there's actually no employees on this. It's the enterprise looking at its own technologies. And so when you do that, very often you end up with systems, to the extent that you use this to prioritize and select, you can end up with systems that aren't necessarily a good fit. So just as importantly, if not more importantly, you need to take a more employee-centered view of the digital workplace, where you start with core employee needs around effectiveness, recognition, ease of use, their desire to work solo, to work collaboratively, to improve the way that they work. And then this brings you to very specific applications. And today we'll be talking about some of the applications in the upper left of this particular circle, social and collaboration, but it should drive you to a number of different sorts of applications. To be sure, there's enterprise-wide services that you see in the purple that are very important. But the key thing is to think of applications as specific business products. And so to that extent, social collaboration, you might think of in terms of, in a more employee-centered digital workplace, as a set of kind of a product portfolio that are helping your employees be more effective, both in terms of their own personal productivity, but also in terms of team and group productivity, and as well in engagement and overall job satisfaction. So you want to take a more employee-centered model, and we'll come back to this because it becomes really critical when we start putting together the test cases for selecting the tools. But then when you look at some of those segments of that pie, there's really quite a lot of vendors. So this is what we call the employee experience technology landscape. So if we look at the overall employee experience, there's at least 160 key vendors, 200 products. There's, of course, in the broader landscape, many, many more. These are the ones that we've just identified as likely the most important. And so obviously it's a wide variety of tools if we're talking about assembling the digital workplace experience. But I wanted to focus our attention today on the upper sort of green row here, collaboration, communication. Really important to get this right. These are kind of table stakes today, particularly in a large enterprise, in a distributed enterprise, in an international or even global enterprise. You've got to get this right. And for a variety of different reasons. First, our work is increasingly interconnected. Secondly, people are inherently social beings, and if you're going to humanize your digital workplace, which I think is what we're all trying to work towards here, if you're trying to humanize your digital workplace, then collaboration and communications really becomes kind of table stakes for that. So let's drill down a little bit on this landscape, and it's always a little bit of a fraught exercise taking a three-dimensional marketplace and putting it on a two-dimensional slide like this. Here we're kind of doing it in a little bit of a complexity spectrum. You've got platform vendors in the upper left that you'll recognize, IBM, Microsoft, and Oracle, whose pitch usually is, well, we have a wide variety of different tools, and nominally, if you buy them all from us, we'll provide you some sort of an integrated experience. In reality, that's really quite mythical. In the real world, their platforms are often very, very poorly integrated, and in fact, often acquired via mergers and acquisitions and that sort of thing. But their notion is, hey, we're platforms are providing a variety of other services to you, potentially email and identity management and a whole set of other things. And so that makes us a natural for supplying social collaboration services. Then as you move to the right on this chart, you get into some interesting spaces here, major suites, which we see as increasingly popular and certainly taking some mind share and market share from the major players. And then smaller suites. Many of these are kind of social intranets in a box, taking a larger footprint, particularly in enterprises of under 1,000, maybe even under 5,000, so sort of the mid-market. Then, of course, you've got a variety of different social enterprise layers. Some of these are full-blown ESNs like Yammer and Workplace. Others are more social layer on top of existing capabilities like Citrian, Tibber, and, of course, Salesforce Chatter. And of course, there's some interesting specialist players in the lower left there. That list is wide and getting wider. Slack, of course, being an important one because it's so ubiquitous. Of course, as we'll see in a minute, it's ubiquitous really against only one use case, but that makes it important. And so again, that gets you thinking about social collaboration as a potential portfolio of tools that together are going to drive effective experiences and make your employees more efficient and more satisfied at work, but that is likely to be a multi-vendor portfolio, and so selecting what are the pieces of those portfolio and do they work for you becomes really, really important. So the traditional approach to this, you probably recognize it, is to look at vendor features, right? And then to look at feature ratings. And you can see these all over the web. You can do it yourself. Very often you see Excel matrices with these sorts of requirements. And we do feature ratings as well. These are our feature ratings of, I believe, Facebook, Workplace by Facebook. And, features are important. The thing is that features themselves usually are thought of and executed in kind of a vacuum. In other words, they're not actually business. They're functional needs, but they're not actually business requirements, right? Now, some of these, in terms of enterprise services, like integration extension, being able to internationalize and localize the interfaces, analytics, these are important, right? But they don't actually tell you whether it's going to be a good fit for the most important or most common employee journeys. So we in our own research do talk about features, but we tend to put it on kind of the second tier. So what would we say as a kind of a first order way of looking at this? So the first thing to do as we describe that is look at what's the nature of the social collaboration gap right now. And this is a pretty big gap in many enterprises. On the one hand, you have at the executive level these aspirational goals, like we need to collaborate more, we need to bust silos, we need to innovate across business units and that sort of thing. All very reasonable from an executive level. The problem is that that alone isn't necessarily going to motivate employees to participate. At a staff level, you have much more instrumental and practical needs, like we need the right answers to our questions. I need to find out who's the expert. I need to quickly form and then close up ad hoc, sometimes perishable teams, sometimes across units, sometimes across the enterprise to accomplish very specific tasks. So there's a little bit of a gap here, and I think just focusing on one over the other leads to problems. We very often see people, for example, implement ESNs, enterprise social networks, because of some executive level aspirations of just people talking more and communicating more, and then they often then kind of die on the vine because they're not necessarily solving a problem for a particular staff person. On the other hand, solving the problem for a particular staff person can lead to a profusion of different tools and a lot of overlap in terms of tooling that does many of the same things. So you've got to kind of meet somewhere in the middle. We believe that the way to meet in the middle is with specific business applications, right? That focusing your aspirations in terms of specific applications that you're going to manage as products in your portfolio is the key to closing this gap and really unlocking the value of social collaboration. And the good news is that this is exactly the way then that you can evaluate vendors, right? Because you can stand them up against particular applications to then describe what they do and don't do very well. So here's the universe of applications, business applications. We call this the arc of participation. So you have in the upper left more formal, structured, collaboration oriented. In the lower right, more informal, unstructured, networking oriented. And these have particular business objectives. Team communications is the one we added. That's the one that's really in Slack's sweet spot. Slack is very good at team communication, so just basically to quickly coordinate small group tasks. Slack is not particularly good at project collaboration. It's awful as a formal knowledge base, right? So this begins to help you understand, okay, where do these tools fit in? Communities of practice, almost table stakes. It's the tip of the enterprise social sphere. Very, very important, particularly in larger enterprises, more knowledge-oriented enterprises. Again, a problem that most of the ESNs on offer aren't particularly good at communities of practice. Innovation support, of course, very sexy, some great use cases around that. Enterprise conversation and expertise location, very critical. Social Q&A, we see many organizations doing this very effectively, a real frustration solver to create these kind of answer engines, and then humanizing your legacy applications. So these are specific business applications, and the reality is that there's no tool across the marketplace that's particularly good at more than 3 or 4 of these. So from a social collaboration perspective, inevitably, you really want to drill down between, really prioritize which are the ones that are most important for us, and then look at the vendors that way. So before we go, we've got a quick question from Dan who's asking, what's the difference between collaboration-oriented and networking-oriented? Great question. Collaboration-oriented tends to be more around particular tasks and usually things that are very goal-oriented. Networking-oriented is more that it's a more human-to-human interaction. It may be less around a particular task, and it may be less goal-oriented. It's more around establishing human connections and connectedness among employees almost as the end of itself, as opposed to finishing a particular workload. So, Daniel, these are abstract concepts. I wouldn't get too hung up on them. As analysts, we like to use them. I think the key thing here is to really focus on the particular applications and which applications are going to drive the most value in your enterprise. So then what's also interesting about this, we can then turn and look at the marketplace that we just explored and say, okay, how good are these vendors at these particular applications? And by this, I don't mean necessarily good and bad, but to what extent are they really targeting them? And then when you look at this, starts to get very interesting, because you see right off the bat, for example, that Workplace by Facebook, and for that matter, Yammer, is really kind of a one-trick pony. It's really focused a lot on conversation and news. It's pretty good at conversation and news and getting better. What it's not particularly good at is expertise location as an answer engine, for innovation support. It's okay at team communication, not great. It has some capabilities for external collaboration, again, not great. It's awful as a knowledge base, right? So this allows you then, this application approach is what allows you to then turn around and look at not just prioritizing your own needs, but what are the right vendors that then provide the right fit. Of course, there's more to this than just applications and matching up with employee journeys. There's any vendor, of course, is part of a larger ecosystem, or should be, and so you want to look at that very closely as well. We find that the breadth and depth of the ecosystem is the biggest predictor of the longevity of that particular vendor, or for that matter, that particular technology, whether it's open source or commercial. So this is really important to look at and evaluate. And the nice thing is that very often you can kind of evaluate this in a very first-hand way yourself. We definitely spend a lot of effort on this in our research, more and more in terms of strategic considerations with respect to things like vendor professional services, customer support, viability and stability. Technical modernity is a big one, because we find that technical debt is a huge issue, value for money, and then this huge ecosystem. So again, with Facebook, the ecosystem is really just kind of forming. Facebook has not put a lot of effort into this, really wants to seem to want to go direct to market. We consider that to be something of a strategic long-term risk with this particular platform. Okay, so that's around selecting social collaboration, which is figure out which applications are going to drive where you need to go, and then match that up against vendor tendencies and figure out which types of vendors then might present a good fit, and then go ahead and start a selection process. So, so the first thing we'll talk about is how not to select. So don't do this. Don't just grab a tool because you happen to have it in your tool shed. We see this very often with Microsoft, IBM, Oracle, sometimes even Google and others, or for that matter, trying to do more with Slack than Slack really wants to do. In the end, this is very frustrating for your employees, right? If they need a much simpler drill and you've got this drill press, don't drop the drill press on the simple vice through a piece of board out in your backyard, right? So this is very inconvenient for employees. Sometimes using something for what it isn't really belong can be catastrophic as well. You can have literally catastrophic failure. We've seen that with ESNs as well, where the real need was for communities or innovation spaces, and instead what they got was essentially an enterprise-wide discussion space, which lacked structure, didn't give community management capabilities, and was just very ill-fitting for the purpose, and collapsed under its own weight. And of course, you don't want to just come down to just guessing, or doing a bunch of demos and saying, looks like this could be good, let's just throw it in there and see what happens. What you really want to do is be methodical, but in an agile, rapid way. So the word of the day here is agile-ish. This is a methodology from the book that my colleague and I, Jared Gingras, just released yesterday from Rosenfeld Media. You can find it on Amazon, The Right Way to Select Technology. It's a very brief 180-page read that will take you through a team-based, test-based, iterative, and adaptive process for getting the right tools for your particular circumstances. So the first thing you want to do is build an interdisciplinary selection team. So you never want IT to just drive this. We sometimes see that with collaboration, where either they take the leadership or the business just abdicates to them. And what works in IT very often doesn't work on the business side. So you really want some business leadership. But on the other hand, you don't want the opposite problem either, where the business is just going out and procuring stuff and not involving IT. Because if you want to use this across an enterprise level, then even if it's a SaaS solution, you want to involve IT because they can help you with the inevitable security and integration and all these other sorts of issues, scalability, which often comes up when you try to get beyond a pilot, identity management. All of these things are really critical. And so you need an interdisciplinary selection team that might involve knowledge management, IT, certainly your marketing, sales, and product. The more revenue-facing are often early adopters of social collaboration tools, important to get them on board. HR is a really critical stakeholder. In an ideal world, HR would actually be driving social collaboration technology initiatives for a variety of reasons. In many enterprises, probably most enterprises, HR does not. But we've seen some great case studies with HR really in the lead and bringing in the other players from IT, KM, and other key stakeholders internally. So you build an interdisciplinary selection team with this person you see here as a business lead who's the chair, right? Then you go through a testable process. So you might end up with a longish list of 10 to 12 vendors. Then ideally you send an RFP to a short list of recipients, or maybe go straight to vendor demos. In each case, the key thing is not to have generic demos or feature-based checklists. What you want are your own applications and user stories. User stories be the center of what you're doing here. So they're not demoing what their tool could do, they're demoing your actual user stories that you've come up with. Then the most important thing is always, always, always hold a bake-off or proof of concept where you're testing two vendors head-to-head, where you're not just watching a demo, but your team is actually getting hands-on, impersonating different personas within your enterprise, and really testing to make sure that it's as usable and as good a fit for your particular business values. So you can articulate what you're going to get out of this at the end of it, and so that you really make the right choice. Again, this all hinges on testable narratives. Leave your spreadsheets aside for the most part. Focus instead on developing actual employee journeys, use cases. You can call them whatever you want, use cases, user stories, scenarios. Some people split hairs around particular nomenclature methodology. The key thing is that it's a narrative. And then in the end, it's really all about fit, right? Like, what's the best fit for your enterprise? And very often our subscribers will bring us in to help facilitate some of the decision-making meetings. And a big part of what we do is just tease out the different trade-offs here. So you might have scenario or functional fit, business fit essentially, which all else being equal should really be the predominant factor. But technology fit and partner fit and value fit are also important. And so those need to play into it. And the key thing is that the selection team understands all of the trade-offs and makes an intelligent decision on what's best for employees and the enterprise is based on this. So to summarize, figure out what applications are important, match those up against a short or long list of vendors, come up with specific user journeys, and then test against those journeys. And obviously, if there's any way that our research can help shortcut this process for you and instill the wisdom of the hundreds who went before you, then feel free to reach out to us. Scott will tell you a little bit more about that. But once again, I'll remind you that if you have any questions or comments or feedback, anything that you'd like to contribute, we still got about 5 more minutes if you want to just put something into the questions tab of your GoToWebinar control panel. So Scott, how can people follow up with us?
Absolutely. So a couple different ways, Tony, and thanks for the presentation. Certainly recommend taking a look at a sample of our research, which you can just go right on our website and download a chapter from our social collaboration research, as well as any of the other marketplaces that we cover. You can also actually try out the tools that would be available to you if you were to become a subscriber, such as the Real Quadrant application for a customized shortlist and the Real Score benchmarking tool. You can also reach out to us certainly by email, and we can take you through a behind-the-scenes tour of the website and the tools that will be available with a subscription. And obviously, Tony and the rest of our analyst team would be available to you as a subscriber to help with a variety of topics, whether that's doing a deep dive on a particular vendor or really helping you with your strategy and developing the roadmap moving forward. It does look like we have a couple questions, so Tony, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, sure. So Rob's asking a really good question about Salesforce. Why are we focusing on Salesforce Chatter rather than Salesforce Communities Cloud? And it's a great question. I think if you look at enterprise social collaboration as a layer, Salesforce historically has really emphasized Chatter and particularly and tried to extend it not just beyond sales teams, but also sort of enterprise-wide. And Communities Cloud historically has been focused more on external communities. So Salesforce is trying to sell it internally. I'm not sure that it's a particularly good fit for internal communities. We see it focusing more on the external community around peer-to-peer customer tech support, and so it's kind of a social CRM play rather than an internal play. That doesn't stop Salesforce from trying to sell it internally, but it's not to date, we believe, a particularly good fit. Certainly, Rob, worth watching going forward, but on the employee side, Chatter has really been the predominant. So David is asking, do you need to pick one platform to be the centerpiece that other specialized apps like Q&A might tie into? Yeah, this is a great question. Would require, I think, David, a lot of time to answer it properly. The basic thing being, do we need an anchor in our shopping mall that then allows for a variety of other tools to kind of revolve around it, more boutique-y type tools? And our answer to that is probably shouldn't just have one. You ought to think of maybe 2 or 3 different anchors. And this is difficult sometimes for an enterprise to get its mind around. And there's some other questions around this as well, but I think it's high risk and potentially low value for your employees. It's certainly easier for the enterprise and easier for IT to think about a single anchor, but you may want to have multiple anchors. So Elizabeth is kind of asking a related question, which was that, we didn't get too much into Office 365 and what was our orientation towards that. And so Office 365 is, of course, much more than just SharePoint. In our SharePoint research now is SharePoint/Office 365 because there's a number of social collaboration capabilities in Office 365 above and beyond SharePoint and Yammer. And so we cover teams and groups and Delve and other things in our own research, and that's all part and parcel of a kind of a broader fabric of services that Microsoft is providing. Unfortunately, I think Microsoft is falling into some of the same trap that they did with SharePoint. I mean, to be sure, Office 365 is an improvement because it's in the cloud, much more rapid innovation cycles, software as a service, all these sorts of things. But they're sort of falling into some of the same trap that they're kind of throwing a bunch of features out there that aren't necessarily polished applications. And without polished applications, you find yourself having to drag your employees into using it rather than them immediately adopting it. I think the second thing is that it's a wide variety of different tools that aren't particularly well integrated right now, no matter what the Office 365 fanboys say. And some enterprises are falling in the trap that they did with SharePoint, which is to just go out and license it and see how many different things they can shove into it, as opposed to how many workloads they can shove into it, as opposed to the way you're supposed to be doing this, where Microsoft is the object of the conversation, of the sentence, rather than the subject. And so you change your grammar and you say, what are the capabilities that we need, and could Microsoft solve for them, as opposed to, hey, we've licensed Office 365, what can we do with it? Which is a very different and a very common sort of approach, I would say increasingly common approach, as Microsoft has made this financially attractive. And it's causing, I think, a fair bit of heartache among and heartburn among digital workplace managers, where their enterprise has thrown a lot of money at Microsoft, and now they have to kind of figure out where to get value, when ideally what they should be doing is thinking about applications in their portfolio that are going to solve specific business problems. So thanks, Elizabeth, for that question, and David for setting it up, and Rob and Daniel and everyone else. Real pleasure being with you in a rapid 30 minutes. I hope you found this useful. Feel free to stay in touch about other webinars, and feel free to reach out to us at any of those coordinates if you have any questions at all about how Real Story Group can make your team more effective going forward. So for Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne with Real Story Group, signing off until next time. Thanks, and so long.